Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to keep up with our latest stories. The air was hot, dry, and unmoving, like the entire world had paused under the oppressive heat. Harsh sunlight carved deep shadows along the lines of metal kennels and open training fields, the kind of light that made everything look sharp and hard. A pickup truck trundled slowly down a dusty dirt road, raising a trail of fine, tan powder that hovered behind it like a ghost of motion. The road led into a rugged dog training camp where the smells of dust, fur, and sweat thickened the air. In the back seat of the truck, Emma sat quietly with her forehead gently pressed against the warm glass of the window. Her eyes followed the dogs running full speed through the fenced yards, but her expression remained unreadable. There was no awe or surprise on her face, only a calm, practiced silence that had grown familiar over time. At just 9 years old, she was small for her age, with a delicate frame and a quiet way of taking in the world. Since the day she was born, one of her legs hadn't worked quite like the other. She walked with a slight limp, relying on a short, worn blue cane that had long ago become more like an extra limb than an object. It had been 3 long years since Emma had last seen her father. The divorce had drawn an invisible line through her life, dividing it into before and after. Since then, she had lived with her mother in a noisy, crowded city filled with strangers and concrete. But now, due to a court-mandated custody agreement, she would be spending the summer here at her father's dog training facility, far away from everything she had known. A full month with a man who existed more in stories and memories than in her life. The place smelled like long hours and sweat, like barking dogs and worn leather. It smelled like effort. Jack, her father, met her with a brief, stiff hug and a half-hearted glance. "You've gotten taller," he mumbled, barely making eye contact before turning away. "Ryan, show her around, would you?" he shouted over his shoulder. Then, without another word, he walked off, muttering something under his breath about schedules, routines, and dogs that didn't wait. Ryan, her older brother, was already 16 and had the kind of presence that filled a space without trying. Tall, broad-shouldered, and confident, he already carried himself like one of the adult trainers. He had their father's approval stamped into the way he walked and talked. With barely a look in her direction, he shrugged and said, "There's not much to see," before letting out a sharp whistle that brought a large German shepherd to his side. Without waiting, he turned and headed toward the training fields. Emma remained standing where they had left her, surrounded by barking dogs, shouted commands, and people too busy to notice her. She tightened her grip on her cane and walked slowly toward a wooden porch near the entrance. She sat down on the edge of the steps, eyes following the flurry of motion around her, trying her best not to feel like a shadow in a place full of purpose. Each morning began almost identically. The camp snapped awake with the sharp barks of dogs and the crunch of boots on gravel. Whistles blew, and orders cut through the air like cracks in stone. Emma sat quietly at the edge of the same porch steps, her cane resting beside her, blue and dependable. She didn't ask questions or try to get in the way. She simply observed, absorbing the rhythms of a place that didn't seem to notice she was there. The trainers moved like machines, efficient and focused, their attention solely on the dogs. Ryan was always out in the field, shouting commands, demonstrating control, earning respect. Jack, her father, only spoke to her when necessary, usually in clipped, distracted tones. Around the camp, Emma was something in the background, a presence tolerated rather than welcomed. Everyone, that is, except Miguel. Miguel had worked there longer than anyone could remember. He was the quiet backbone of the camp, the man who fixed broken fences, filled water troughs, and walked the perimeter before dawn like a guardian making sure the world stayed whole. His face was a map of deep lines and sun-weathered skin, and his hands bore the marks of years of labor, rough, calloused and stained with the world he worked in. He didn't speak often, but nothing escaped his notice. One late afternoon, as Emma sat watching the dogs being let in for their evening feeding, she heard slow, measured footsteps approaching. Miguel eased himself down onto the step beside her with a quiet grunt. In his hand was a small bundle wrapped in a crinkled napkin. Without speaking, he gently unwrapped it, revealing a warm, slightly misshapen peanut butter cookie. "You hungry, little one?" he asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Emma looked at the cookie, then at Miguel. She hesitated, lips parting as if to respond, but instead she simply shook her head in a soft, slow motion. Miguel didn't push. He just placed the cookie beside her on the wooden step. "In case you change your mind," he said simply, then stood and walked away, his presence as unhurried as ever. The next morning he returned, this time with 2 small paper cups filled with orange juice. He handed her one and nodded toward a large kennel at the far edge of the field. "You ever hear about Blay?" he asked. Emma shook her head again. Miguel's gaze drifted toward the kennel, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll meet him soon enough," he said. "Big dog, strong, angry too, but he's got his reasons." For the first time since she'd arrived, something in Emma shifted. She looked up not just with her eyes but with interest, with something close to curiosity. It was on the 3rd morning that things began to change. Emma had taken her usual seat near the training field when a sudden burst of shouting split through the air. It wasn't the usual routine commands. These voices were different, sharp, frantic, laced with panic. Something was wrong. Sound of claws scraping against concrete, a metal chain clanging against the floor, and dogs barking in a frenzy. She grabbed her cane and stood, heart racing. The noise came from the far side of the camp, near the isolated kennel Miguel had pointed out the day before. Trainers wearing. One man stumbled backward, his arm bleeding, as others shouted orders and tried to form a circle around Thick Emotion, and in the center of it all was Blaze. He was larger than she imagined, lean. Muscles stretched tight in her black and tan fur, ears alert, mouth open in a silent snarl. The leather harness dangled from one side, torn. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, and his eyes darted between every thread could see until they landed on her. Blaze stilled. He stared, unblinking, intense, as if the world had narrowed to a small girl standing just outside the cows. A trainer called his name. Another raised a pole. One didn't react. He just looked at her long enough that it felt like time was waiting for something, and in that moment something shifted. Behind those sharp amber eyes he didn't see a thread, he saw a flicker of something he recognized. Fragility, maybe heard, a quiet kind of strength that didn't bark or fight back, but endured. And beneath, aloft of someone who had never tried to control him, Emma felt the breath catching her throat. She wasn't afraid, not Opheme, because in Blaze she saw something raw and wild, yes, but not dangerous. There was a mind behind those eyes, alert and aware, but tired of being feared, and a heart buried maybe, but still they're still beating. She didn't move, he didn't grow between them. Something past a threat unseen, unspoken, impossible to explain. Then One huffed softly, turned and trotted back to the far corner off enclosure. He sat down, head lowering. The trainers froze. One of them muttered, "What the hell just happened?" Emma didn't know, not exactly, but Shek knew it mattered. The next morning, the trainers gathered for breakfast, and Ryan ran drills in the main yard. Emma slipped away. She walked slowly, tapping softly against the dirt path until she reached the far edge of the camp. The quietest place on the property. Below. One's kennel stood apart from the others, reinforced with a double gate system and steel fencing. A hand-retenting read, "Caution, do not approach alone." Emma didn't cross the barrier. She didn't call out his name. She just sat. She found a patch of grass under the shadow of a tree, near enough to see him but far enough not to provoke. Her legs stretched out in front of her, the can resting beside her. Like a silent companion in her pocket was a small piece of apple, half bruised from Fuik. One didn't move at first. Hess stood near, The back of his tense ears tilted forward, tail low, but nodded. His eyes followed her steady and sharp. Emma unwrapped the apple slice and set it gently on a flat stone near Thiefan's close, but not inside. Then she turned to her spot and said nothing, and so began a new rhythm. Each morning Emma returned. She never brought attention to herself. She didn't whistle, didn't coax. She simply was a small presence in his world, asking nothing, demanding nothing. One began to notice he didn't bark, he didn't growl some mornings. He stayed back, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Other times he crept forward, sniffing the air from a cautious distance, but never touching fruit she brought. By the fifth day, Miguel appeared behind her with 2 paper cups of juice. He didn't speak at first, just sat down beside her on grass and stared through the fence at Blaze. Surprisingly, One didn't react. No growl, no alarm. Miguel nodded slowly. "That's new," he said. "He never stays this calm when someone's near his fence." Emma didn't answer, but her eyes didn't leave the dogs. Something was changing. Neither of them knew what it meant yet, but they both felt it. By the end of the first week, the morning ritual had become an unspoken tradition. Emma arrived at the same time each day, her steps steady but slow, the cane clicking rhythmically, like a quiet drum. One wassail ways. "They're now waiting." He wouldn't come close, but he never turned away. That morning, the sky was overcast, and the camp felt quieter than usual. Emma pulled a small slice of cheese from her pocket, wrapped in a napkin this time. Instead of lacing it on the stone by the fence, she moved just a little closer. She knelt slowly, carefully, and extended her hand through the lower corner of the fence, resting her palm on the dry ground. The cheese lay flat across her open fingers. One didn't move right away. He watched her in that still, deliberate way of his, like he was measuring the weight of her presence. Then, step by cautious step, he came forward. Emma felt her chest tighten, her fingers curled slightly without meaning to. She wasn't sure if it was fear or aware. Both. Her mind whispered everything she'd heard about him. Aggressive, unpredictable, and yet none of that matched the animal standing in front of her. Now there was something different in his eyes, not wildness, but hesitation, as if he too was unsure what this moment meant. And the closer he came, the more Emma felt her fears soften into something quieter. Not confidence exactly, but trust, a fragile lichen, the kind that holds its breath. Because in Blaze, she didn't see a threat, saw something alone, something to rate a soul that had been shouted at more often, spoken to, not angry, but misunderstood, maybe in some quiet way. Looking for someone who could see past the surface. One reached her hand, sniffed gently, then without warning gave her fingers a single soft lick. Rough and warm. Emma's breath caught. He took the cheese delicately and stepped back without sound, and then something even more surprising. She extended her hand again, slowly, without food this time, just to be there, and Blaze, steady and calm, let their fingertips graze the side of his muzzle behind her. A sharp voice snapped, moment and half. Emma. It was Ryan face. Red steps, fast and furious. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted. "Are you out of your mind?" Emma stood slowly, shaken but calm. "He didn't hurt me. You think you're special. That dog has bitten grown men to the bone." Ryan's voice cracked with fear. Masked his anger. "Stay away from him. Next time you might not be so lucky." By the time the dust of Ryan's anger had settled, the news had already reached Jack. By the time Emma returned to the cabin, her father was already waiting at the door, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Ryan stood beside him, still fuming, his eyes darting between her and the ground. Jack didn't yell, not at first. His voice came low, clipped, full of something heavier than anger. "I heard what happened." Emma nodded. She stood straight, her canna tucked close to her side. Jack stepped forward. "You disobeyed the warnings. You put yourself in front of Blaze. He didn't hurt me," she said softly. "That's not the point." Jack snapped, voice rising. "You don't know what that dog is capable of." Nearly tore through a handler last month. "You think a moment of quiet changes what he is." Emma didn't answer it because she didn't have words, but because none of them would matter. Jack continued, "He's unstable, dangerous. You could have been mauled." "Emma, I'm not going to sit back and let my daughter get hurt because she thinks she understands something she doesn't." Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper but steady. "I do understand him." Jack blinked. "Excuse me." Emma looked up. "He's not dangerous. He's scared and tired and maybe. No one's ever really listened to him before. For a moment, something in Jack's face flickered, then hardened a dagon. Enough. He turned away, ran a hand through his hair, then looked back at her. You can't stay away from that dog. Then I will. I'll have him removed from this camp before sunset. I should have done it weeks ago. Emma's heart sank. Yoken, she said, barely breathing. I can, Jack said coldly, and I will. He walked off without another word, boots crunching the gravel with finality. Emma stood frozen in place, her fingers tightening around the cane, her chest aching, her throat burned with fluid of unshed tears. She felt small, dismissed, like nothing, she said, could ever be enough, and yet deep inside her something solid began to form, not anger, not rebellion, just the quiet certain tiffet. She wasn't wrong, and somewhere across the field, Blade, though he couldn't hear the word, slid out a low, uneasy growl. From deep inside his kennel the next morning came heavy with silence. Emma awoke to the sound of boots hulling on gravel, the low murmur of men talking outside, and the sharp clink of metal tools. The smell of coffee drifted through the window, but it didn't comfort her. She moved quietly, slipping in her shoes, grabbing her cane and stepping outside. Miguel was on the porch, it in hand, his eyes more tired than usual. They're moving him, he said before she could even ask Emma. Blinkadade. He nodded. They called a transport van. He'll be gone by noon. Her breath caught in her throat. I told your dad is making a mistake, Miguel added, his voice low, but I can't stop this. Emma gave a small nod. She wanted to speak, but words wouldn't come. Miguel touched her shoulder gently, then walked off to join the others. She didn't follow, not yet. Instead, she circled around the back of the barn and crouched behind a low stack of hay bales where she could see without being seen the field near. Bla's kennel was full of motion. Jack, Ryan, and 3 other handlers were on site. One man held a tranquilizer gun, another had thick gloves and a control pole. They were moving with careful tension, like men approaching a bomb. Bla one sensed it happened in tight circles inside the kennelier's pinned tail, low, every muscle taut like a coiled spring. His bark came deep and sharp, bouncing off the fencing. Emma watched with her hands pressed against her knees, her breath shallow. A gate opened. One of the handlers took a step inside with the pole extended. That wassail it took. Blah one exploded. He lunged with such force that the chain on the gate snapped backward. The handler fell hard, shouting. Blaze burst from the enclosure like a storm let loose. Dirt flew under his paws. His body low, wild, unsettable them, and scattered. The second handler reset the tranquilizer aimed, but Blaze spun away before the shot could land. Then head and eyes locked on Jack, who stood in the open with nothing but a rope in hand. Emma gasped, one hand over her mouth. Of everything slowed. Blaze thundered across dirt, his body a blur of motion, earspin, jaws clenched, eyes blazing. Jack didn't move. Maybe he was frozen, maybe had thought he could handle it, but Blaze was seconds away and no one could stop him from behind the barn. Emma broke into Arun. She didn't think there was no tomato. Think her cane slipped from her hand, falling somewhere behind her. The ground was uneven, her steps unsteady, but somehow her legs carried her forward. Shouts around her blurred into noise. Amin screamed her name, Miguel, maybe Orion, but all she saw was Blaze. She reached the center of the field just as Blaze closed the final distance to her father. Blaze, she cried. It wasn't loud, but it cut through everything. The dog skidded. He stopped just feet away from Jack, his chest heaving, teeth bared and eyes wide. Emma stood in the space between them, trembling but firm, her hair tangled by the wind, her hands slightly raised. It's me, she said softly. I'm her. Blawan's breathing slowed just barely. His body still shook with adrenaline. Dirt clung to his legs, his tail stiff behind him, but he didn't move for word. He didn't growl. His eyes locked onto hers, and the world narrowed again, just like that day at the fence, just like the apple. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full. You're okay, she said, her voice breaking at the edges. No one's going to hurt you. She took a step closer, and Blade didn't flinch. Another step. Then she reached out. Her hand was shaking, her knees weak, but her eyes were steady when her fingers brushed his muzzle. Bla one lowered his head slowly, carefully, and let out a breath that sounded More like a sigh than a growl, he sat, ears relaxed, tail twitching low around them. The camp was still. No one moved. No one spoke. The monster had stopped, not because of force, not because of fear, but because a girl, small, quiet, and unseen, had chosen to see. Him in a place built on commands and control. Silence had never been louder, and in that silence they all saw what they had missed for a long moment. No one spoke. Below one sat beside Emma, his head lowered, tongue flicking out to lick the dust from his muzzle. Her hand still restudiantly against his fur, steady, now gnawing or trembling across the field. Jack hadn't moved. His chest rose and fell with heavy, confused breaths. In one hand still held the rope, limp and useless. His other hand hovered near his pocket where the tranquilizer command button had been ready, but he hadn't used it. Mitchell was the first to break silence. He stepped forward. Slowly, "I's never leaving the girl and the dog, I told you," he said softly, almost to himself, "from the day she sat by Fat Fence." I knew. Ryan stood a few feet behind, stunned. The arrogance in his posture had slipped. His hands hung at his sides, empty. He looked at Blay, then at Emma, and for the first time he didn't seem to know which of them surprised him more. Jack finally walked forward cautiously, stopping just a few steps from his daughter. His voice wasn't. He swallowed. "I was wrong." She turned to face him. There were tears in her eyes, but no anger, just exhaustion and something like quiet relief. "I didn't need to control him," she said. "I just needed to listen." Jack nodded slowly, like he was learning something he should have known years ago. "I'm sorry," he said to both of you. Ryan stepped closer. "Me too," he muttered, not quite able to meet her eyes. "I didn't see what you saw." Emma looked at them both, then down at Blay. He looked up at her, tongue lolling, slightly, tail brushing the ground. Once that afternoon the tranquilizer van drove away. Empty. Blay stayed from that day. When it was no longer kept behind locked gates, he followed Emma everywhere, not because he was told to, but because he chose to. And Emma, she was no longer invisible. Sometimes it takes a storm to show the world what quiet strength looks like, and sometimes the fiercest souls are not meant to be tamed but understood.